Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Disaster Management Symposium, brought to you by American City and County Urgent Communications and IWCE. I'm Andy Castillo, editor at American City and County, and your moderator for the first of 3 webinar presentations, Disaster Planning, Preparing for the Worst. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Rock Technologies, for making this session possible. Throughout the day, myself and Donnie Jackson, editor of Urgent Communications, and Michelle Havich, who is also an editor at American City and County, will be talking about disaster management with a diverse selection of panelists who, in one way or another, interface with or work for the public sector. We'll be talking about how they incorporate technologies in the many administrative decisions city and county officials must make. We'll explore 3 phases of disaster management: preparation, response, and recovery. After we finish this session, look for a link that will bring you to the next session. Before we begin, let me run through a few housekeeping items. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You can also download them and other resources from the resources folder, which is available via a widget at the bottom of your console. You can submit questions to our presenters at any time by typing them into the Q&A window. And if you're experiencing technical problems, please type your issue into the Q&A text area, and someone will connect to provide one-on-one assistance. You can also hit F5 on Windows or Command-R on Mac to refresh your console and audio stream. Now, let me introduce our panelists. Ryan Ackerman, administrator of the Souris River Joint Board and a water resource engineer and CEO at Ackerman Esfold. Michelle Geddes, Chief Information Officer for San Francisco's Department of Emergency Management. Pat Hart, Senior Director of Resilience for the American Public Power Association. And Jason Harris, CTO of Rock Technologies. You can find the full bios and the speaker bio widget at the bottom of your webinar console. Anyone who's been through a disaster knows they're not neat. The phases don't precisely fit into planning, response, and recovery. One thing leads to another. When I was thinking about how to organize this session, I thought of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which was the deadliest industrial disaster in the history of New York, and one of the deadliest fires in US history. 146 garment workers died. Most were women and immigrants. The number of dead was so high because the doors and stairwells to the exits were locked, a common practice back then to prevent unauthorized breaks and theft. The fire is well known in the fire service because it prompted the creation of the modern fire code as we know it. Mandatory fire drills, fire inspections, working hoses, sprinklers, visible exit signs, fire alarms, they were all implemented after the tragedy. Climate change and the increasing devastating effects of natural disasters is having a similar impact on communities across the country. Administrators are learning from one disaster and planning for the next. The process is cyclical. One thing leads to another. So to kick things off, I thought we'd hear about an event as a case study. One of the most devastating flood events on record, the 2011 Souris River flood, which impacted the Minot region of North Dakota. And to put it into perspective, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimated the flood had a recurrence interval of not 100 years, but 2 to 5 centuries. We'll start with Ryan. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do first, and then talk about the 2011 flood, its impacts, and the planning and project that came from it?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy, and thanks everyone for joining me. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your location. I'm Ryan Ackerman. I'm a water resources engineer, and I work as the administrator for the Souris River Joint Board. It's a multi-jurisdictional water resources board in north central North Dakota. Our board represents 4 counties along the Mouse River in North Dakota. I say Mouse because that's the legal name of the river in North Dakota. It's known as the Souris in Canada, so Souris is French for mouse. In an act of defiance, our state legislature officially codified Mouse as the name of the river in North Dakota in like the 1990s, which is kind of ridiculous because you're not going to find a nicer, more polite population on the planet than our neighbors in Saskatchewan. So in addition to that, all federal agencies still refer to it as the Souris, but I digress. A couple of things that are pretty unique about the watershed. First of all, it's international, as I've already alluded to. The headwaters originate in Saskatchewan. The river then travels into North Dakota before making a U-turn and heading back to the northeast, eventually entering Manitoba. Secondly, we're in a prairie pothole region in this part of the country, meaning that there's an abundance of wetlands in the watershed. As a result, the hydrology of our basin is extremely volatile. During a typical year, runoff would be fairly limited because water is stored in these prairie potholes. However, during the exceptionally wet years, these prairie potholes fill and then they spill, meaning that the flows in the river increase not only due to the amount of precipitation that is experienced, but also because the watershed physically grows. To give a sense of scale to this, the watershed in 2011 increased by approximately 200% in terms of size when the pothole wetlands filled. You know, a third thing that's rather unique about our situation is that we have 4 reservoirs on the watershed above the population center of Minot, North Dakota, which is where I'm located. 3 of these reservoirs are in Saskatchewan, and the 4th is north of Minot in North Dakota. The operation of these reservoirs is then prescribed by an international agreement between the 2 countries of the United States and Canada. As Andy alluded to in the earlier remarks, we experienced a record flood along the Mouse River in 2011. Significant snow melt was predominantly captured within the upstream reservoirs. But the spring runoff from that snowmelt was followed by several successive large rain events, eventually culminating with a mid-June rain event, which dropped about 7 inches of rain upstream of the largest flood control reservoir on the system in Saskatchewan, which was basically full. Okay, so as a result, dam operators were forced to open the gates of that reservoir to avoid losing the dam and basically match outflows out of the reservoir with the inflows coming in. So we saw 27,000 cubic feet a second of water within the city of Minot. For context, the current 1% annual exceedance probability flood, or the 100-year flood, is 5,000 CFS, so almost 5.5 times the 100-year flood. The economic damages were significant, about $1 billion in direct economic damages. Probably a bigger impact was the loss of about 4,000 homes during the height of what is the Bakken oil boom, when housing supply at that time was critically low already. Definitely a dark period for the region and the community, as fewer than 10% of those homeowners carried flood insurance. For a little bit more context, the federal government had constructed a flood risk management project that consisted of the reservoirs that I've described, including flood control improvements to 2 of the Canadian reservoirs, along with improvements at Lake Darling in North Dakota, and levees and channelization efforts within North Dakota as well, all designed to pass that 5,000 cubic feet a second. Since 2011, the Souris River Joint Board, which is who I work for, has developed a flood risk management plan that includes both non-structural and structural approaches. And Andy is flipping through some of the structural approaches on the side, showing some of the construction that we've been undertaking since about 2014 or so. The overall strategy includes floodplain development restrictions, acquisitions, construction of levees, flood walls, diversions, and establishment of a greenway that's going to be used for flood risk management activities, as well as recreation and educational outreach. We're trying to connect our residents back to the river to kind of flip the narrative about a feature that we've kind of grown to fear and loathe to something that we appreciate. Our design event is the flood of record. It's what we experienced in 2011. And the rationale for it is it's simple. It happened. We're about 50% into this $1.1 billion capital project. On the topic of disaster preparedness and planning, a few insights or lessons learned based on this past experience. Number one, be prepared to make your own decisions. Other agencies are likely going to be there to help during a disaster, but ultimately the buck stops with the locals. Don't wait for others to make a decision for you. Second piece would be develop your own risk assessment matrix to guide your decision making. A little bit of context with this one. Understand the shortcomings or assumptions which feed into forecasts or data being issued by others. Also understand in context the other risk drivers that you may be facing, because those forecasts may not take those other risk drivers into account. Third piece, understand your legal authorities. There's no doubt that your emergency manager stressed this, but this is something that you definitely want to handle ahead of the time-sensitive window associated with a disaster, flood fight effort or whatever. Ask yourself the question, do you have the authority to do things like ordering evacuations? Do you have the authority to call for enforcement? Another piece that we've learned is to develop our own after-action reports to capture the lessons learned of the locals. There's no more valuable set of lenses to look through the disaster than those people that live with the infrastructure every single day. And then probably the last piece that I would offer would be that after a disaster or even a tabletop exercise, if you're doing it kind of hypothetically, take a step back and evaluate which entities might be affected greater to identify your best partners and champions in preventing future impacts. And I'll give you just one example. In our case, Minot Air Force Base is home to 2/3 of our nation's nuclear triad deterrent, with the B-52 bombers and the 150 Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. When the flood occurred, transportation was essentially hampered, and a majority of the missile field was isolated from the ground logistics at the Air Force Base. So imagine the Mouse River in North Dakota looking like a U, okay? The Minot Air Force Base would be a dot centered on the interior of that U, and basically 3/4 of the missiles are on the exterior of that U, basically isolated from surface logistics within the base. So now understand, it's the Air Force. They've got the ability to get to where they need to get. So they certainly were able to fight their way through it. But it represented a national security risk and also a force readiness risk for that important mission, or those important missions up on the base. So by understanding those broader challenges, we've been able to secure partnerships with Department of Defense to bring additional resources to the table. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the dialogue as we do this.
Thank you, Ryan. I was in a writing class with somebody from the North Dakota region years ago, and you're talking just sparked memories of a piece that she wrote about just houses being washed away. So it was certainly really impactful on the locals. And thinking about disasters like the Souris River flood, let's turn to Pat. It seems like these climate change driven and century disasters are increasing in frequency, and they're getting worse with every time. And it's difficult for organizations to plan for what comes next because the bar is constantly moving higher. Pat, could you tell us a little bit about what you do and your role, and then also describe how public power organizations are handling disaster planning?
Sure, great. Thanks, Andy, and thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. So again, my name is Pat Hart. I'm the Senior Director of Resilience Programs at the American Public Power Association. My organization represents the community-owned, non-for-profit electric utilities that provide low-cost electricity to more than 49 million Americans. Our members are in about 2,000 communities across the United States, ranging from large cities like Austin, Nashville, Los Angeles, to also some small towns, for instance, in the Navajo Nation. So I've been personally working in emergency management for the past 15 years. First started at FEMA, then the Department of Homeland Security. And for the last 9 years, I've been focused in the energy sector, first starting at the Department of Energy and now at the American Public Power Association. So what Andy asked me to talk about today, and you saw in the intro, is to talk a little bit about how the public utilities prepare for, respond to, and recover from major incidents or disasters, and then also talk a little bit about what's changed and how they've planned for disasters over the last 10 or 15 years or so. But before I get too far, I just want to talk a little bit about some background on the emergency management system. And the way I kind of like to look at it, it's really a series of backstops. So all disasters are local, whether it's a house fire, tornado, what have you, and the ability to respond to that event, if it exceeds the local resources, a state can jump in to assist. And when the capacity of the state is exceeded, the federal government can jump in and provide resources to assist in that response. Now, for this system to work, it must be scalable. So that's why FEMA has developed the National Incident Management System to create a response structure at each level of government that is the same. And this allows the state or the federal government to add resources to an existing structure that's already responding that will quickly expand the capacity of that organization to respond and recover more quickly and effectively. So we could talk all afternoon about NIMS, the National Emergency Management System, but if you'd like more information, I encourage you to go to ready.gov or FEMA's website. So first up, how are public power utilities prepare for and respond to disasters? When thinking about preparing and responding, we like to think about it in two main buckets. First is unity of effort, and the second is unity of message. So unity of effort is just aligning how we prepare and respond and recover, within an organization, across the industry, and with government and community partners. In terms of unity of message, that's ensuring that the organization, industry, and all levels of government are delivering clear and consistent messages about how they are responding to the incident. Now, in terms of unity of effort, typically what happens is that our utilities plan of how they're going to respond to an incident and develop some priority lists. So after the life, health, and safety mission and debris removal, immediately following a disaster, we are next. And obviously that recovery process can't start without power. So we pre-stage crews, and when it's safe to do so, they begin the restoration effort based on those priority lists that they've developed ahead of time and typically coordinated with local and state officials. Those priorities, obviously the focus initially will be on critical facilities like hospitals, water treatment plants. Schools are also important. And the reason is it's important to get children back into the schools so parents can get back to work or focus on their personal recovery efforts with insurance or rebuilding their homes, etc. So our members want to respond quickly, but their highest priority is safety. So they have to take things in a very step-by-step basis in order to restore power, but they want to keep the community safe. They want to keep our crews safe. Another thing to talk about in terms of how we respond is mutual aid. So mutual aid is the centerpiece of how our industry responds to major incidents. It's based on voluntary partnership between utilities to assist each other in power restoration efforts. So it allows the utility to temporarily increase the capacity of their utility to restore power with additional crews and equipment that they borrow and pay for from other utilities. Now, each segment of the industry has their own mutual aid system that they rely upon. The public power, that system is helped coordinated by the American Public Power Association and my team. The investor-owned utilities have their own program, and the rural electric co-ops have their own program. Now, saying that there are three different programs, there are some times where they do overlap. Public power is part of the IOU system out on the West Coast, and typically once crews finish responding to response needs at municipals or utilities, we offer up our crews to other utilities. Good example is Hurricane Idalia earlier this year. A lot of our utilities, the mutual aid utilities, finished up responding in Florida, and then they offered to help some co-ops and an IOU in their response. So the second thing that I want to talk about is that unity of message. So very quickly, you can develop some great response plans, but they won't be effective unless you clearly communicate that plan. So ensuring that you and your partners, and that includes government, industry, local leaders, etc., are speaking with one voice is critical. It can really make the difference in a response operation. You don't want the mayor to be saying one thing and a government official or a governor saying another. It creates confusion in an already challenging environment. So effective messaging will inform customers, about the steps they can take to prepare and protect themselves and their families and communities, and set expectations for the restoration so they can make plans and decisions about how they will begin their recovery process. Again, it's difficult to start that process until power is restored, and we need to be able to make sure that they know when that's going to happen to the best of our abilities. It has already been mentioned, another way to prepare is through exercises, to take those unity of effort and messaging plans and test them and update them as needed. We hold exercises regularly. They range from tabletop exercises within a utility to large multi-utility exercises with our federal government partners. Those exercises need to be regular with a commitment to follow up on areas for improvement. And one other thing to highlight about exercises, they're a good opportunity to build relationships. I had an old boss at FEMA said that you never want to be exchanging business cards on the tarmac. You want to have those relationships in place and use those relationships once you need to during an event. So I'm running up against my time here, but that's sort of the overview of how we sort of prepare and respond for incidents. But I'll be happy to take some questions when we get to Q&A.
Thank you, Pat, and we'll certainly have more questions later. I'm glad that you mentioned NIMS. In another life, it feels like I was a firefighter in the Air Force, and I got NIMS 300 ICS. Yeah, that's it. 300. It certainly allows all of these really disparate organizations. You have power, water, any number of public or private organizations, puts them onto the same page, and it allows local governments and counties, such as Michelle represents, to be able to coordinate and organize really complex responses, and then also to flexibly adjust depending on the conditions. So turning to Michelle, could you share a little bit about the challenges that San Francisco faces and how you're overcoming that, particularly in relation to 911, which is oftentimes the starting point for all of these efforts?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And good morning from beautiful San Francisco. Let me just give you a little bit of background on San Francisco. We are an extremely diverse city. We are at 49 square miles, both a city and a county. We have approximately 800,000 residents, but over 2 million visitors annually. And we process about 1 million calls for service annually. And this is for police, law enforcement, fire, and medical response. So we are a small, diverse, but busy city. Department of Emergency Management is a department within the city and county of San Francisco. We are responsible for coordinating all city county-wide emergencies in San Francisco. We run the 911 center in San Francisco. We are also responsible for all operations relating to activating the EOC, Emergency Operations Center. We also have our EMSA, our Emergency Medical Services Agency, which partners with hospital and ambulance providers across the city, delivering 911 emergency transport. And we're also, the Department of Emergency Management also manages the Urban Area Security Initiative, the UASI, and we administer millions of dollars in Homeland Security grants for the region. And then my job and my team as the CIO of this department is really, I ensure that all of these emergency responders and even the first responders have the tools and technologies they need to do their jobs. And so those are things like the 911 phone system. We manage the emergency radio communication system countywide. We're responsible for our technologies that alert the public in an emergency. And we also get to house, because we are in such a resilient facility with 911, we also house the city's citywide data center. So we have critical infrastructure that we're consistently protecting. And so having this space and being responsible for the 911 system is a 24/7 operation that my team manages daily. And we have many initiatives, many large initiatives. One of them being how we alert the public, in light of the disasters that we saw in Maui and these continuous weather events. We're looking at how do we improve our alerting. We're looking at re-engaging our siren technology, our emergency alert system. We're looking to improve the way we get text messages delivered to the public for visitors and for residents. We're also looking to improve our computer-aided dispatching system. We have an outdated technology and system. It's an on-premise based system, and we're looking to not only make it more resilient, but eventually get it into off-site DR recovery in the cloud. And then one of our largest initiatives is really improving the 911 experience. We're partnering with the state of California to roll out next generation 911 technology. And the first step to that is to migrate all of our analog telephone lines literally coming into the facilities, upgrading them to an IP-based network, and being able to harden the backbone to the 911 system. And then we will be looking to migrate all of our on-premise based call handling equipment that is currently in the building, and we're going to be migrating that into a cloud-based CPE. And there are several vendor partners that the state of California, for example, has worked with, tested, and so now local municipalities will partner with one of the cloud-based CPE providers to roll out next generation 911 so that our center, our PSAP, will be able to support multimodal communications between the public and our 911 center in the hopes of improving 911 response during emergencies. And so we deal with a lot of emergencies in San Francisco. We were responsible for the citywide COVID response, Department of Emergency Management. We're even grappling with our street conditions in San Francisco and our overdose and opioid crisis. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion around how we deal with emergencies and the technologies that we use in these types of events. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And speaking of technologies, Jason, could you tell us a little bit about how organizations are leveraging GIS when planning for disasters?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great lead-in. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. We've heard lots of really cool programs and some great tools and initiatives, just like Michelle was just talking about, that move to the cloud that folks are using to help prepare for these, potential disaster scenarios and events. And I suspect that most of us here probably know what a GIS or geographic information system is, and how it can play a pretty crucial role with responding to these types of disaster events. But for the sake of people that may not be familiar with GIS, real quick, I'll just say it's a tool that helps us analyze data spatially with the use of maps, and it gives us some really good insight into those data patterns. It's widely used throughout private organizations, state, local, federal government, utilities, land management, emergency management, and response. These are just a couple of the departments and organizations that use GIS. But specifically here, we're going to talk a little bit more about how emergency management can use GIS to help better prepare their communities and respond. And even more important is to recover from these emergency events like tornadoes or hurricanes and wildfires. These can all strike with little or no warning, so it's really important to be prepared, right? So in times of disaster, you need to be able to rely on your GIS for this very critical information. On-premise infrastructure can be very vulnerable to these types of emergencies. For example, we had a client one time whose EOC was not kidding here, quite literally destroyed during a hurricane. And that was the purpose of the EOC, right? Unfortunately, it just basically blew away. These on-premise systems can be very vulnerable in other ways too. Can they quickly scale up to meet the increased demand? Like, as GIS has become such a crucial tool for disaster response, its use has grown exponentially. And we're talking about public-facing tools. We're talking about internal facing tools for your staff and other agencies. So consider if your on-premise system, if it can quickly scale up to meet that increased or critical data. Will the public be able to see the active fire zones? Will your staff be able to access these critical decision-making tools? And these are questions that you really should be thinking about and answering now, because obviously during a disaster, that's probably the last time. You don't want to be thinking about it then. Every second really counts. So I think that all of us know about the cloud and how more and more organizations have moved or considering this move to the cloud. And I think that this point can't be hammered home enough that it's such a good fit for GIS, moving the GIS to the cloud, right? So we can go to the next slide. But when your GIS is deployed to the cloud, you can solve all of those problems that I just outlined: scaling, uptime, disaster recovery. This is a slide that I use a lot to help visualize all the benefits of moving your GIS into a cloud environment. But for the sake of this, we're just going to kind of focus on the emergency and disaster response. First and foremost, like I just mentioned before, it's that ability to scale, right? The infrastructure in the cloud can scale up very rapidly to meet that increased demand from the public. It's the internal staff and all of the other agencies. The thing about scale also is we're talking about the infrastructure. And when we move to the cloud, we have to remember that these cloud data centers are located typically very, very far away from a disaster area. Typically speaking, they're very solid geology, away from the coasts, et cetera. They all contain very highly redundant and hardened systems. So power, water, internet connection. So when we move to that cloud, we also even have the further ability to disperse our applications across multiple geographic zones to lessen the impact of a potential outage, right? The second big one that I see with a cloud move, particularly in emergency situations, is that ability to be able to collaborate from anywhere. COVID has really changed the way we work, and the trend of having that ability to work from anywhere becomes more and more important, particularly in times of these disaster events. It's absolutely critical that all the different departments, all the agencies, the remote employees, which we have a lot of now, evacuated staff, that they all have a dependable access to your tools and your data. We've talked so much about all these different scenarios and all the tools that we're generating. We want to be able to give all of your users, regardless of where they are physically located, we want to give them access to these virtual desktops, and all of that comes along with it, all of your data, the tools. We want to ensure that there's going to be an effective disaster response. So all of these tools that everybody's talked about, and all these initiatives and programs, if none of these tools, none of that data is going to do anybody any good if no one is able to access it, right? Lastly, I'm going to mention this, and this is not something that's often considered during a disaster preparedness and response exercise, right? And that's the security of your system. Are your systems safe from cyber attack? So we know a cyber attack is essentially a disaster in itself, and it's going to hamper your ability to respond to one. I don't have a lot of time to dig in too deep here, but it really is my very firm belief that all the tools available to you in the cloud that your system can be safer, more resilient, and far less vulnerable to attacks than your on-premise infrastructure system might be. Sad part is I could talk about this for hours. I'm a bit of a nerd, so throw some questions up if you want to discuss that anymore, or ping me after. And then the last slide I'm going to show. This is just a real quick example of a real world situation. So we've worked with Nassau County, Florida for probably 20 years plus at this point. So we're dating myself, and this is all pre-cloud, right? That's a long time ago. Anyway, when their systems were on premise, they were, quite frankly, they were very vulnerable. Their physical hardware was in a disaster-prone area. They did not have that ability to scale that hardware up in times of demand. And unfortunately for them, this type of demand happened all too often. And that demand, as you probably have guessed, is hurricane season. They're on the southeast coast, so one big storm could potentially wipe out all of their hardware, all of their infrastructure. And this is all during when the public needs access to that crucial information the most, right? They need to know what their hurricane evacuation zone is. So they just had to hope that they had enough bandwidth. They had to hope they had the infrastructure to meet the demand. And they also had to hope that their power wouldn't go out, right? That's crazy, but it's true. Well, so I could tell you that Nassau County was actually one of the very first or early adopters of moving their entire GIS system to a cloud-based environment. And it's a good thing they did, because that scenario that I just mentioned actually played out. A Category 4 storm was closing in on the county. So what they did is they went out and they announced on the Jacksonville, Florida Evening News that their interactive evacuation zone finder map tool was now available online. They blasted that URL out wide, to a 1.5 million size metro area, right? Needless to say, we're managing that system for them in the cloud, and we saw like a 500x increase in traffic within that 30 minutes after they blasted that URL out on the news. But we were able to very, very quickly scale up their infrastructure to meet that need. If you can consider the alternative, if it was still on premise, that traffic would have quickly overwhelmed the system. The citizens wouldn't know if they should evacuate or not. What zone am I in? Should I leave? And that's really life and death stuff. I mean, that's what you guys have to deal with every day. But the county, recognizing before this move, really the terrible hand that they had been dealt for hurricane season every year, but they actually did the work and they prepared for it. They moved their infrastructure. They gave themselves that ability to scale. All of their GIS staff and emergency planners, they all had access to virtualized desktops that had all of their data, all those critical tools where those decision makers can get in and help with the disaster and the disaster response. They're no longer tied to their office computer. So with that, I hope I've left you with some answers and maybe how to prepare, and really how the cloud can play a really important role in helping that along. Yeah, I am a bit of a nerd, so again, I genuinely enjoy talking about this, so feel free to get in touch if you want to chat more. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jason. So we're going to turn to questions now. So at any point during this next discussion, if you have any questions, type it into the question box and click submit. And we have one that came in, and it sort of coincides with something that I was going to ask Michelle. So this works out nicely. Michelle, you mentioned Maui and the auditory alert system and just alerting people in general, which is a really big topic of discussion. As technologies advance, you can get notifications on your smart TV now. So just thinking about that, somebody asked, this person works at SFPUC, the treatment plant, and they asked, what should their construction workers do when the earthquake early warning activates?
That is a great question. And most important thing is to be prepared, right? The messaging around earthquakes is what? Drop, cover, and hold, right? When you're working in those extreme conditions like you are in small confined spaces that you would at a water treatment plant, I think the most important thing really is before you go into that, you need to be prepared in case that type of event happens, right? And so it's really a question around, do you have, for example, the radio communications tool so that you can communicate to somebody outside of the space if there was emergency? Do your peers know where you are in the facility if you need some sort of a rescue? And I think, I work to make sure that those technologies are available, and so those workers feel like they are safe in the event of that kind of an emergency. And so being prepared is really the most important thing, is to prepare yourself in the event that a situation like that could happen.
And just as a follow-up to that, how has San Francisco's use of alerting changed as technologies advance, as we have a better understanding of the impact of disasters? How has that evolved?
We are trying to be as diverse as possible and have as many tools in our toolbox as we can. We still have our the call box systems around San Francisco, so you can still walk up to an analog box and get to our 911 center. And so we have ensured that we have as many tools as we can. We've invested a considerable amount in our alerting technologies. We actually built a watch center that is almost a 20-hour and then on call. We have personnel that filter through the emergencies and the calls for service that are happening, and then push out, avoid the areas or road closures, and those kinds of things, so that our residents know when an emergency is happening. Unfortunately, we had to turn off our siren system. We turned it off, the outdoor public warning system, in 2018 because we actually had a cybersecurity vulnerability. Hackers actually posted how they could activate the system remotely, and so we turned it off. And since then, we have been chipping away over time at our strategy on how we can provide that basic, we call it the tone, the siren, the Tuesday at noon siren, how we can get that reactivated in a more concise environment, not as large of a rollout, but get something up that is much more resilient. And so we're working to do that in the very near term, because we just need every tool that we can to alert the public.
It seems like redundancy is a really important factor there. And thinking about sort of cloud security, Jason, what's security in the cloud like as compared to, say, a data center?
Yeah, that's that's a great question. The way I look at it is, if you're in your local infrastructure, if you're in your local data center, right? You're at that point, I don't want to say cobbling together tools. Your IT is I'm sure more than capable of getting all those different tool sets for security, network inspection, logging, all of those different tools, pieced together to be able to monitor everything, right? The difference is in the cloud, all of that is already integrated, so to speak. So you have access to extremely advanced logging, traffic inspection, all these different types of tools, and you can put that in one pane of glass, so you're not working with systems over here and pulling them all together. There's a much more robust, cohesive tool set available to you in a cloud environment, right? Not to mention, I think, once you're in the cloud, you don't run that risk of somebody dropping a USB stick into the back of one of your servers, right? That's often overlooked, but that's one of the main ways that people gain access to on-premise systems, right? That's not really going to happen in the cloud environment.
So pivoting away from technology a little bit, Ryan, you mentioned in your presentation that there were lessons that you learned, that your organization learned, that the region learned. What are some of those lessons, and what would you do differently if you were going to, go back to 2011 and do it all over again?
Well, I think, playing Monday morning quarterback 12 years later here is probably a little bit inappropriate. But first of all, I think having our own risk assessment matrix to make decisions about what we should be doing, having that information in hand and having that tool in hand in 2011 would have resulted in different outcomes for sure. So a little bit of context here. I mentioned that we had a significant snowpack followed by several successive rainfall events. One of those rainfall events occurred in late May, and it resulted in the evacuation of about 10,000 residents. Okay. The metrics that were being tracked by our federal partners and by everybody at the time included flows within the river, short-term and long-term forecasts, things like that. So kind of looking at the fact that the river had crested following this initial flood threat and the initial evacuation, and seeing nothing alarming in either one of the forecasts, the decision was made to lift the evacuation order, let people move back in, and start to actually take down some of the emergency flood fighting measures that were in place, including levees. The one key, or a couple of the key risk drivers that weren't being monitored closely at the time, or they were certainly being monitored, but they weren't feeding into the decision-making matrix, were levels in the upstream reservoirs. The reservoirs were basically full, and that represents a pretty significant risk should something occur upstream of one of those reservoirs. So, that is certainly a tough lesson learned, and something that that we currently do track differently and establish kind of our own qualitative risk assessment of the situation as we see it versus I'm going to call it the quantitative, forecasts that come out of agencies, as an example. So we've just really adjusted our approach to assessing our own risk, and I think as a result we're more resilient to deal with the next thing.
And Pat, considering this risk assessment and thinking about how we prepare, how organizations prepare for future disasters, what are some of the major challenges that power companies and more broadly utilities are facing when considering future disasters? How are they preparing for them?
Well, again, it's the planning that I mentioned earlier, that unity of effort, unity of message. The one thing that we've done our members done over the last 10 to 15 years is that we're far more organized now. We have these battle-tested plans for restoring power quickly and safety. It used to be that our mutual aid networks were more regional and based on personal relationships, but we now have a very intricate system in place that allows us to pull crews from multiple regions. We have good relationships now with government partners to help provide waivers, transportation waivers, fuel waivers to get those crews across different regions into where the impact zones are. Utilities themselves have more detailed response plans in place that they've coordinated with a variety of state and local officials. They've budgeted for sort of those plans. And they've done a better job once they've been impacted of doing assessments at the very early stages, which can really make a big difference in how they're actually going to tackle that response operation, in addressing the priorities first and then getting down to the large number of outages. There's two things that are really driving those changes over the last 10 to 15 years. Obviously, as you mentioned, Andy, at the outset, there are more frequent and more destructive weather events. So it's becoming a question of when a community is going to be impacted, not if. So there's a real imperative to actually prepare for those events. And the second thing that's driving is customer expectations. As we become more reliant on our energy reliant on energy in our day-to-day lives, there's a greater emphasis on quickly returning to normalcy. And the public utility commissions are also focused on reliability on behalf of the customers. So those are the two things that are driving a lot of the changes that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years.
So, sort of turning and posing this question to you from a municipal perspective, you've talked a lot about technology, and everything about technology relies on power. We're so reliant on utilities these days. How is San Francisco making those connections with, non-public or quasi-public or private organizations to make sure that everybody's on the same page when they need to be?
Well, let me just say, power is one of the most important things that an IT professional needs to be successful. And I have had several challenges with power events that have brought down critical IT systems in the middle of the night. And one of the most challenging ones was caused by human error that brought down a major power system in the 911 center. And I luckily had my PG&E rep on speed dial. And the very first thing I said, I called him in the middle of the night and I said, what's going on with power? And he was able to partner with me through that entire event to work with us on restoration. And so, having the relationships with the critical infrastructure providers is so important. And so when we activate our EOC, we have an entire section of personnel that deal with critical infrastructure. So our water supply, our power, all of our utilities, so cell phone utilities, we have Verizon, we have FirstNet, we have these private organizations responding to the EOC, or if not, one step away from who do we call during the emergency or a special event. We've had some really great successes partnering with the private entities to help us deploy additional radio communications, additional devices, laptops, tablet infrastructure for strike teams coming into San Francisco when we have these special events. And so public-private partnership in that regards during an emergency, I think, is so important. And they respond into our EOC, and they know the city staff that keep the city running. So it's really just about having those relationships and pulling them into the organization when we're planning.
And speaking of power outages, somebody asked, this one's for Michelle again, what alternate modes of communications would you recommend when all electricity and cell phone towers are down?
Okay, I'm just going to go back to the same thing, and it's to be prepared and be diverse. So I don't know about you, but I carry two phones. I have a Verizon phone. I have an AT&T phone. We have, generators to care. We actually have, internet on, even at my home, on backup power, so that we still have these critical events. But having redundancy is so important, right? Is having multiple modes. The alerts go out via cell phones. There's also internet-based alerts. We activate in San Francisco. We activate the emergency alerting system. So we have partnerships with all of the broadcasters to get emergency information out to the public. So it's really about diversity and having multiple modes of communication.
So this next question is about GIS. So either Jason or Michelle, whoever thinks they can, most accurately address it. So this person asked, from Kauai County, I'm not saying that correctly, GIS. So in Maui, their GIS team was overloaded with information and requests from so many sources that it failed. How can organizations prepare for this type of situation if it happens again? So the question is about overloaded GIS systems.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly kind of what I was talking about. In the times, those periods where this access to this, like the most critical information, during these periods is during a disaster where people need that information. They need it now. And what inevitably happens is everybody descends on this one site or this one application, and that traffic influx is going to take down a system if it's not able to scale, right? We need that ability to, let that mapping application or that piece of GIS technology or whatever we're talking about here, right? It's not limited to GIS, but we want that to be able to assign, additional compute resources so that and more bandwidth so that application can actually respond, right? With all of that additional traffic, right? So sure that our systems are, the short answer is scalable. There's a lot of things that are behind the scenes with saying something is scalable, but the cloud is one, really good example of something that makes it easy to scale, right? You could go buy a bunch of hardware for your on-premise data center, and you could buy $100,000 worth of servers. And 99% of the time, they're going to sit there idle because you don't need all that compute power. The cloud lets us, quickly scale up to that $100,000 worth of infrastructure hardware, and in 5 days when we're done, shut it back off. We've paid a small fraction of what it would take if we tried to do that on premise.
Thank you. So the last question, this is from the audience. Can someone speak to the need for exercising emergency backup systems? The worst time to test a backup system is when you need to use it in an emergency. So whoever thinks they could best address that.
Well, we do our best to test our backup systems. We have backup systems for the 911 capability, for our radio system, and we actually have a 911. We have our primary 911 center, and then our backup 911 center it's a cold backup, and we actually have to take staff from the building, somehow get them about a mile away, and then set up a backup facility. And it's an onerous process and it takes time, but we do this exercise of moving the personnel and setting up the technology. We do it almost monthly, and we rotate the amount of staff that go through it so that there are more individuals familiar with the environment. And it's exactly like you said, so that you're prepared, and in the event of that evacuation or that need, you know what to do, and there are people that can help.
Thank you. And thank you all to all of our panelists for that excellent discussion. As we wrap up our session, I'd like to thank you all in the audience for attending today's session, Disaster Planning, Preparing for the Worst, which is presented by American City and County, Urgent Communications, and IWCE, and brought to you by Informa. Coming up next, you'll hear from Donnie Jackson in our next panel as they discuss the next step, as we've laid it out, disaster response. In a moment, a link for the next session will appear on your screen. Clicking on it will take you to that session. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. The session is copyright 2023 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by American City and County, Urgent Communications, and IWCE, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our speakers, I'm Andy Castillo. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next session.